The first snow of 1883 fell on Redemption Creek, Wyoming. On the same night, Clara Beaumont decided she hated Cole Whitaker with every fiber of her being. She had not always felt that way. In fact, for most of the autumn, she had been fairly certain she was falling in love with him, which made the whole business of hating him considerably more complicated and considerably more painful. Clara had arrived in Redemption Creek in September, stepping off the stage from Denver with 2 traveling trunks, a leather satchel full of her late mother's recipes, and the quiet, steadfast determination of a woman who had decided to start over. She was 22 years old, with dark brown hair that she pinned back sensibly during the day and let fall past her shoulders in the evenings, and she had eyes the color of the Wyoming sky in October, that particular shade of blue that cannot quite decide whether it wants to be gray. She had come west to take the position of schoolteacher, a position that the town of Redemption Creek had been advertising in 3 eastern newspapers for the better part of a year, without finding a single taker willing to brave the frontier. Clara had been willing. Clara had been more than willing. She had been desperate for something new, something that was entirely hers, something far removed from the small, crowded apartment in Cincinnati, where she had spent 2 years nursing her mother through consumption, and then 2 more years grieving her in absolute silence. Redemption Creek was not a grand town by any measure. It had a main street of hard-packed dirt that turned to mud with the rains and froze solid in winter. It had a general store run by a broad, cheerful man named Harold Finch, who stocked everything from flour to rifle ammunition, and who never seemed to tire of conversation. It had a church with a bell that rang every Sunday and sometimes on Tuesday evenings, when Pastor Greer felt particularly moved by the Spirit. It had a saloon called the Copper Spur that was louder than the church by a considerable margin. It had a sheriff's office, a livery stable, a small hotel called the Driftwood Inn, a blacksmith named Otto who spoke mostly in grunts, and about 230 souls spread across the town and the surrounding ranches and homesteads. And it had a schoolhouse, which was Clara's domain from the first Monday of September. She loved it immediately. She loved the smell of the chalk and the pine desks, and the particular way the afternoon light came through the west-facing windows and fell across the children's faces when they were bent over their slates in concentration. She had 17 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and she learned each of their names and their particular ways of learning within the first week. She wrote to her friend Margaret in Cincinnati that it felt like being alive again, truly alive, in a way she had nearly forgotten was possible. Cole Whitaker came into her life on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after she arrived. He was not a man who made a grand entrance, which somehow made him more difficult to ignore. He simply appeared in the doorway of the schoolhouse at the end of the school day, hat in hand, his dark hair damp with perspiration from a long morning of work, wearing a blue chambray shirt that was faded from many washings and leather gloves that he tucked into his belt when he stepped inside. He was 28 years old and had the kind of face that a painter would call interesting rather than handsome, though Clara privately thought it was both. There was a seriousness about his jaw and a warmth about his eyes, which were a deep, steady brown, like creek water in summer. He was there to fix the school's front steps. The second one had a crack running through it that had been getting worse since spring, and the school board had apparently finally gotten around to addressing it. He said this very simply and directly, without any of the exaggerated courtesy that some of the other men in town used when speaking to her, as though she were made of china and needed to be handled carefully. Clara appreciated that. She thanked him and gathered her things to leave him to his work. He said it would only take 20 minutes if she wanted to wait, or she could leave him to lock up. She said she would wait, and so she sat on the top step and watched him work, and they talked. She learned that he was the foreman on the Harlan Spread, the largest cattle ranch in the valley, about 4 miles east of town. She learned that he had come to Wyoming from Texas when he was 19 and had never found a reason to leave. She learned that he read, which surprised her for reasons she was not entirely proud of, and that he had strong opinions about the works of Mark Twain. She told him she preferred Louisa May Alcott, and he said he had not read her, and something about the honest way he said it without pretense or dismissal made her want to bring him a copy the next time she saw him. The next time came 4 days later, when she saw him at the general store. She had the book tucked under her arm because she had thought she might run into him, and when she saw him, she felt a warmth rise in her face that she chose to blame on the September sun. She handed him the book. He looked at the cover, then looked at her with those steady brown eyes, and said he would read it and report back. He did. 2 weeks later he came by the school again, this time on a Saturday, with the book and a careful, thoughtful account of what he had made of it. He said he found it more moving than he had expected, and that he thought the oldest sister was the most interesting character, and Clara had disagreed so passionately that they had spent an entire hour sitting on the repaired front steps arguing about it in the most delightful way imaginable. By October she looked forward to Saturdays in a way that had nothing to do with the end of the school week. He began walking her home in the evenings when he happened to be in town, which seemed to happen with increasing frequency. They walked the length of Main Street and then down the narrow path beside the creek, and the aspens were turning gold and the air smelled of coming cold, and Clara thought she had never had a friend who felt so immediately essential. That was what she told herself he was, a friend. It was a lie she told herself with great conviction. On the 1st of November, he brought her a jar of preserved peaches that the cook at the Harlan Ranch had put up in summer, saying he had thought she might like them, because she had mentioned once, in passing, that her mother used to preserve peaches and the smell of them always felt like home. Clara held the jar and felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been very carefully locked up since her mother died, and she thought that either this man was the most naturally considerate person she had ever met or he was paying a very particular kind of attention to her. She hoped with everything she had that it was the latter. She was not wrong. She knew she was not wrong. The way he looked at her when he thought she was not looking, the way he always positioned himself slightly between her and the street when they walked, the way he listened when she talked with his full and undivided attention, as though what she was saying was the most interesting thing happening anywhere in the world at that moment. She was not wrong, and yet he had not said a word, had made no move, had kept himself at the precise and careful distance of a man who was thoroughly in control of himself. Clara was beginning to think that being thoroughly in control of himself might be his worst quality, and then the snow came, and everything changed. The first snow was light, just a dusting that turned the world white overnight, and then half melted by noon the next day. Clara stood at her window in her room at the Driftwood Inn and watched it fall and felt a pleasant anticipation, because she had always loved winter, and because she had the perhaps foolish idea that being snowbound in a small western town with a man she was absolutely not in love with might somehow accelerate certain emotional developments. She saw Cole the next morning, briefly, outside the general store. He tipped his hat to her and said good morning and said the snow had come earlier than expected, and she said yes, it had, and she smiled at him with what she hoped was warmth and invitation, and he looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite decipher, and then he said he had to be getting back to the ranch and he left. She stood in the street and watched him ride away and told herself it meant nothing. But then a week passed and she did not see him. She told herself he was busy with the ranch, with the cattle, with the approach of winter, which she knew was a genuinely demanding time for working ranchers. Another week passed. She began stopping by the general store more than she strictly needed to, because Harold Finch always knew everyone's business and could be relied upon for information delivered with great enthusiasm. Harold told her Cole had been in 2 days ago, buying supplies, and had seemed fine. Clara smiled and bought a tin of crackers she did not need and went home. Another week passed. She saw him once across the street from a distance. He looked up and she lifted her hand in greeting, and he looked at her for what felt like a very long moment, and then he turned and walked in the other direction. She stood in the frozen mud of Main Street and felt something inside her go very still and very cold. He was avoiding her. There was no other explanation. He was deliberately, pointedly, unmistakably avoiding her, and she could not for the life of her understand why, except for the possibility that perhaps she had been catastrophically wrong about all of it, about the peaches and the books and the walks along the creek, and perhaps what she had taken for tenderness had been nothing more than ordinary frontier courtesy directed at a newcomer who needed some help settling in. And now that she was settled, he had simply moved on with his life, and she was standing in the street like a fool. The weeks accumulated. November gave way to December. The cold settled over Redemption Creek like a hand pressing down, and the snow came in earnest, piling up against the storefronts and drifting in the alleyways, and Clara threw herself into her work with the ferocity of someone who needs very badly to be occupied. She decorated the schoolhouse for Christmas with paper stars and pine boughs. She organized a small winter pageant for the children's families. She exchanged long letters with Margaret in Cincinnati, in which she described the landscape with great eloquence and did not mention Cole Whitaker once, which was a kind of heroic restraint. She was angry. She was hurt. She was angry at being hurt, because she had told herself repeatedly not to build anything on the foundation of a man's attention, and she had built something anyway, and now here she was in the wreckage of it with frozen feet and wounded pride. December was a long month. She heard his name occasionally. She could not prevent it in a town this size. Pastor Greer mentioned at Sunday service that Cole had donated lumber for the repair of the church's side wall, which had been damaged in November's first hard freeze. Harold Finch mentioned that Cole had organized a supply run for the Whitfield family out on the North Homestead, old Jeb Whitfield having taken sick with pneumonia, and the family being in danger of running short before spring. Clara absorbed these pieces of information and filed them away, and refused to examine what they told her about his character, because she was busy being angry at him. What she did not know, could not have known, was that Cole Whitaker was riding past her window 3 nights out of every 7 that winter. He rode the perimeter of the town in the dark, in the cold that dropped to 20 below and sometimes lower, his breath and his horse's breath making great clouds of steam in the moonlight, and he watched the streets and the alleyways and the approaches to the Driftwood Inn with the careful attention of a man who has a very specific and very serious reason for what he is doing. The reason had a name, and that name was Doyle Hatch. Cole had known Doyle Hatch for 7 years, ever since Hatch had ridden for the same outfit in Texas that Cole had worked for as a young man. He had known even then that Hatch was the kind of man you kept careful track of, the kind of man who smiled easily and meant nothing by it, who could be friendly 1 minute and dangerous the next, and who had no particular principles organizing his behavior, except the principle of his own immediate advantage. Hatch had been dismissed from the Texas outfit for reasons that were never fully explained to the ordinary hands, and Cole had been relieved to see him go. He had been considerably less relieved when Hatch rode into Redemption Creek in late October, 2 weeks after the first conversation that Cole had thought about every day since. He had seen Hatch at the Copper Spur, sitting at a corner table with 2 men Cole did not recognize, men with the particular look of hired trouble, and something in Cole's gut had gone cold and quiet in the way that it did when things were about to become serious. He had not approached Hatch. He had watched him from the bar, and Hatch had watched him back across the room with those flat, pale eyes that never gave anything away, and then Hatch had smiled, and Cole had known, with the certainty of a man who has learned to trust his instincts at the cost of learning them the hard way, that there was something brewing. He had asked around, carefully and quietly. Harold Finch, who genuinely knew everything that happened in Redemption Creek, confirmed that Hatch and his 2 companions had taken a room at the Driftwood Inn, the same inn where Clara Beaumont was staying. Cole had stood in the cold outside the general store for a long moment with that particular piece of information sitting in his chest like a stone. He had thought about the way she smiled. He had thought about the ease with which she trusted, the open warmth that she offered to the world, the way she had handed him that book as though it were the most natural thing in the world to give a near stranger something she loved. He had thought about all of that, and then he had thought about Doyle Hatch's smile, and he had made a decision. He had to pull back from Clara. He hated it with a specific and grinding thoroughness, because there was nothing in his experience or his nature that prepared him to deliberately cause pain to a person he cared about. But he understood enough about Hatch to know that drawing Hatch's attention to a connection, any person he valued, was the most efficient way to give Hatch a lever. And a lever was exactly what Hatch would use. What he was not sure of was what Hatch was actually after. He had asked Tom Greer, the sheriff, to look into the three men, and Sheriff Greer had gotten word back from Cheyenne that Hatch had outstanding warrants for robbery and assault in 2 territories. But knowing what Hatch had done in the past did not tell Cole what he was planning in Redemption Creek, and until he knew, he could not give him any tools to work with. So Cole watched. He watched from a distance, in the cold and the dark, while inside the warm light of the driftwood in Clara Beaumont was reading by her fire and telling herself she had been a fool to feel anything for a cowboy who turned his back on her in the street. There were nights that cost him something he could not name. He had spoken to Doc Harmon about Doyle Hatch, told him to keep his ears open for any unusual inquiries about the town's residents, particularly the schoolteacher. Doc Harmon had raised his eyebrows and then had nodded with the discreet professionalism of a man who has kept secrets in small towns for 30 years. He had spoken to Mrs. Foley, who owned the Driftwood Inn, asking her quietly to let him know if any of the men in room 4 showed unusual interest in the other guests. Mrs. Foley had agreed with the compressed-lip severity of a woman who ran a respectable establishment and intended to keep it that way. The information that came back to him was not reassuring. Hatch had been asking questions about the teacher, not in any way that was overtly threatening, not in a way that would raise alarms in someone who did not know what Hatch was. He asked about her in the way that any newcomer might ask about an interesting figure in a small town. He asked how long she had been there, and where she had come from, and whether she had family in the area or was entirely on her own. That last question was the one that made Cole's jaw tighten when Mrs. Foley reported it to him, her voice low and her eyes sharp with concern. He pieced it together slowly, the way you piece together a puzzle when you are missing some of the pieces and have to infer the shape of the gaps. He talked to Sheriff Greer again, and Greer did some additional digging, and by early December they had a clearer picture. There was a man in Denver named Arthur Beaumont. He was Clara's uncle, her father's younger brother, and he was deeply in debt, the kind of debt that does not come from honest business but from the kind of enterprise that operates in back rooms and speaks in whispers. And he had apparently made some kind of arrangement with Doyle Hatch, the details of which were not entirely clear, but which involved the use of Clara as a mechanism. Perhaps he wanted money from her, though she had little enough. Perhaps he wanted to force her back to Cincinnati, where she would be under his influence. Perhaps it was something more sinister than either of those things. The precise outlines of the plan were murky, but the intent was unmistakable. Hatch was there to coerce Clara into something, and he had been sent by someone who wanted leverage over her. Cole rode to Cheyenne himself, 3 days through hard winter weather, to consult with the territorial marshal and to file a formal report. He came back with the marshal's promise to send deputies within the month, and with the knowledge that Hatch could not be simply driven off without evidence of an actual crime, because men like Hatch were careful, and they did not give you the evidence until they were ready to act. He kept watching. He kept his distance from Clara, which was the hardest thing he had done since the day he buried his father in the Texas hardpan, and he told himself that she was safe, that she was warm and working and alive, and that was what mattered. That was the only thing that mattered, and he would sort out the rest when this was over. He saw her at church on the first Sunday of December, and she sat in the third pew and wore a dark green coat that he had not seen before, and her hair was pinned up with a small spray of dried winterberries, and he thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and he sat 4 rows behind her and stared at the back of her neck and felt like the worst kind of fool. She did not look at him once. He walked home from church that day with his hands in his pockets and his head down, and he thought that, when this was over, if she would even speak to him, he was going to tell her everything, every bit of it, and then whatever she decided would be entirely up to her and he would accept it. He thought he could probably survive her deciding she wanted nothing to do with a man who had caused her pain, even if he had caused it for reasons he believed were right. He thought he could survive it. He was not entirely certain, but he thought so. Christmas came and went. Clara organized her pageant, and all 17 of her students performed it admirably, and the families of Redemption Creek sat in the schoolhouse and clapped, and for 2 hours on a Thursday evening, the small building was bright and warm and smelled of pine, and there was singing, and Cole stood in the back because he had been invited by Harold Finch's daughter Nell, who was one of Clara's students, and he watched Clara directing her children with that particular combination of warmth and authority that she had. And something in his chest ached so specifically and completely that it was almost like a physical injury. She saw him. Their eyes met across the schoolhouse, over the heads of the assembled families, and for one unguarded moment he let himself look at her the way he had been refusing to let himself look at her for 2 months, with everything in it, all of it, unfiltered and honest. And then she looked away, quickly, and the expression on her face was not the expression of a woman who felt nothing. He went home to his bunkhouse at the Harlan Ranch and sat up half the night in front of the stove and tried to think about something other than the exact shade of her eyes in the lamplight. He could not. January was bitter. The temperature dropped to levels that made working cattle an act of genuine physical endurance, and Cole spent 12-hour days in the saddle helping to move the Harlan herd to the sheltered south pasture, and breaking the ice on the water troughs and patching sections of fence that the cold had made brittle. He was exhausted in a way that went into his bones, and still every third night he rode the perimeter of Redemption Creek and watched. He had kept Sheriff Greer informed of every observation. The marshal's deputies had arrived in late December, quietly, taking rooms at the Copper Spur and presenting themselves as passing ranch hands, and Cole had briefed them on everything he knew. Together they watched Hatch and his 2 men and waited. Hatch was patient, which was his most dangerous quality. He conducted himself with perfect ordinariness, keeping to the saloon and his room at the inn, causing no visible trouble, making conversation with the locals in the easy way that charming, dangerous men have. Cole watched him make friends with people who had no idea what he was and felt a particular cold fury that he kept very carefully in check. The move came in the second week of January. Cole had ridden into town on a Wednesday afternoon to pick up supplies for the ranch and to have a brief conference with Sheriff Greer. He was at the general store when Harold Finch said, in the tone of someone passing along interesting news, that Miss Beaumont had received a visitor that morning, a man who had come in on the stage. He had gone directly to the school and asked to speak with her, and she had sent the children out for an early recess. Cole's hands went still on the counter. He walked to the school. He did not run, because running would draw attention, and Hatch's men were somewhere in this town, and he did not know exactly where. He walked with the measured, deliberate pace of a man who is very calm and very focused, and he went around to the side of the schoolhouse and listened. He could hear voices through the thin wall. A man's voice, smooth and reasonable, saying something about family, saying something about obligation, saying something about a debt that needed to be settled, and about how there were ways this could go, ways that were easier and ways that were harder, and it would be better for everyone if the easier way was chosen. Clara's voice, steady and tight, and carrying the particular quality of someone who is frightened and will not let the fear show, said that she did not know what he was talking about and that he needed to leave. Cole came around to the front of the schoolhouse and opened the door. The man inside was not Doyle Hatch. He was a smaller man, perhaps 50, with a soft face and quick eyes, and a suit that had once been good and was now past it. He turned when Cole entered, and there was a flash of something in his expression, calculation and adjustment, before it settled back into the smooth urbanity he had been using on Clara. Clara looked at Cole, and the expression on her face in that one unguarded moment was so complicated that he could not fully read all of it, but relief was in there, unmistakably, alongside the anger she was clearly still carrying toward him, and he held both of those things in his chest and looked at the man in the suit. He said quietly, "I think the lady asked you to leave." The man said he was simply having a conversation with his niece and that this was a private family matter and perhaps Cole would be good enough to wait outside. Cole looked at him for a moment. He said, "You are Arthur Beaumont." It was not a question. The man's eyes changed slightly. He said that was correct and that he really did not see what it had to do with Cole. Cole said, "I think you should go to Sheriff Greer's office right now and wait there. The territorial marshal has some questions he would like to ask you." There was a pause. Arthur Beaumont looked at Cole and then at Clara and then back at Cole, and whatever he saw in Cole's face, which was nothing dramatic, just a very particular kind of absolute stillness, made him decide not to argue. He picked up his hat, gave Clara a look that was equal parts reproach and warning, and walked out of the schoolhouse. Cole watched him go. Then he turned to Clara. She was standing very straight in the center of her classroom, her hands clasped in front of her, and she looked at him with an expression that he could not quite bear. She said, "How did you know his name?" Cole said, "I have known about him for some time. I am sorry I cannot explain everything right now. There are things happening that need to be dealt with first." "Are you all right?" she said. "I am perfectly fine." Her voice was cool and even, and he could hear the controlled hurt in it like an undertone in music. She said, "I did not know that you were still aware of my existence." He looked at her. He said very quietly, "Clara." She looked away from him. She said, "Go deal with your things, Mr. Whitaker." The Mr. Whitaker hit him somewhere under the ribs. He deserved it. He knew he deserved it. He said, "I will explain everything. I promise you I will explain everything. But please, for right now, do not be alone. Go to Mrs. Foley or go to Harold's store and stay where there are people." She turned those October eyes on him, and there was a storm in them that he thought he would probably deserve to stand in for quite some time. She said, "You have been ignoring me for 3 months, Cole Whitaker, and now you want to tell me where to stand. I do not think so." He wanted to say everything, all of it, right there in the middle of her schoolroom with the children's Christmas artwork still on the walls. But he could hear from somewhere across town the raised voices that indicated things were unfolding, and he knew Hatch was still out there, and that Arthur Beaumont was walking toward the sheriff's office, and that the next hour required his full attention. He said, "Please. Please trust me for one more hour." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression that he could not entirely follow, something complex and evaluating. Then she said very carefully, "1 hour." He went. What followed was the concentrated, decisive resolution of something that had been building for 3 months. Sheriff Greer had Arthur Beaumont in his office within 20 minutes. The 2 deputy marshals had been alerted and moved through the town to locate Hatch and his men. Cole found Hatch at the Copper Spur as he had expected, and the confrontation was brief and considerably less violent than it could have been, because Cole walked in with Sheriff Greer behind him and the 2 marshals flanking him, and Doyle Hatch, for all his other qualities, was a man who understood numbers. Hatch was arrested on the outstanding warrants from Cheyenne. His 2 companions, who had outstanding warrants of their own in other territories, were arrested alongside him. Arthur Beaumont was held for questioning and eventually charged with conspiracy, a charge that would follow him back to Denver and keep him thoroughly occupied with his own legal difficulties for the foreseeable future. It was over by mid-afternoon. Cole stood in the street afterward in the January cold and let out a long, slow breath that seemed to carry 3 months of held tension with it. The town looked the same as it always did. The smoke rose from the chimneys, and the snow was packed hard on the street, and somewhere from the direction of the general store, he could hear Harold Finch's big laugh carrying through the cold air. He went to find Clara. She was in her schoolroom. The children had been sent home early when the activity in the town became apparent, word traveling with the efficiency that only small towns can achieve, and she was alone at her desk with a stack of papers in front of her that she was clearly not reading. She looked up when he came in, and the expression on her face was precisely calibrated to give nothing away, which meant she was feeling a very great deal. He took off his hat. He stood in the middle of her classroom with the afternoon light coming through the west windows, and he told her everything. He told her about seeing Hatch in October and recognizing him, and understanding immediately what it meant. He told her about the questions Hatch had been asking about her. He told her about the ride to Cheyenne and the conference with the marshal and the weeks of watching in the cold. He told her about Arthur Beaumont and what he and Hatch had been planning. He told her all of it, all the parts he had been carrying alone through the long winter while she sat in her warm room at the inn and believed he had forgotten she existed. When he finished, the room was very quiet. Clara sat at her desk and looked at him. Her hands were flat on the stack of papers and her jaw was very slightly tight, and her eyes were doing something complicated that he was watching as carefully as he had ever watched anything. She said, "You rode the perimeter of the town at night." He said, "Yes." She said, "3 nights out of every 7. He said, "Yes." She said, "In 20 below temperatures." He said, "Sometimes lower." She said, "And you did not think to tell me." He said, "I was afraid that if Hatch knew you mattered to me, he would use you to get to me. And you mattered to me. You have mattered to me since the second time I came to fix your front steps, and you argued about book characters for an hour." Another silence. The light was moving across the floor the way it did in the late afternoon, long and golden. She said, "I was so angry at you." He said, "I know." She said, "I told myself I had been foolish. I told myself I had invented something out of nothing and that I was a ridiculous person for doing it." He said, "You were not foolish, and you had not invented anything." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "You should have told me, Cole, even a word. Even just a word that something was wrong." He considered this. He said, "You are right. I am sorry. I was so concerned with keeping you safe that I did not think enough about keeping you from pain. I should have found a way." She stood up from the desk. She walked to the window and stood there for a moment with her back to him, looking out at the white and frozen town, and he let her think and waited, because she had earned the right to take whatever time she needed. When she turned around, her expression had shifted. The careful neutrality was gone, and what was underneath it was everything she had been keeping very controlled and very private for 3 months, and it was not anger, or rather it was not only anger. She said, "Do you have any idea what this winter was like for me?" He said, "I think I have some idea." She said, "I was alone in a strange place, in the cold. And the one person I had allowed myself to trust seemed to decide overnight that I was not worth his time. I went to bed every night for 3 months telling myself to be sensible and not to care, and every morning I woke up and I still cared, and I hated myself for it." He crossed the room. He stopped a few feet away from her, and she did not move back, which he noted with the careful attention of a man who had been paying attention to this woman for months. He said, "I am sorry. I am genuinely, deeply sorry for the pain I caused you. I did it believing it was the safest choice. I know now that there are different kinds of safe." She looked up at him. She said, "What is the other kind?" He said, "Telling someone the truth, trusting them with the full weight of a thing instead of trying to carry it by yourself to protect them from the carrying." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said very softly, "Yes, that kind." He reached out and took her hand, which was small and cold and steady in his. He held it and said, "I am going to ask if I can start over. Not from the beginning, because I do not want to go back to not knowing you, but from here, from this moment. And I am going to be entirely honest with you from this point forward, even when honesty is complicated." She looked at their joined hands and then up at his face. She said, "And if I am still angry at you?" He said, "Then you are still angry at me, and I will wait." She made a small sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an exhale, and she said, "I am still angry at you." He said, "I know," she said, "but I am less angry than I was this morning." He said, "That is something." She said, "It is something," and she did not pull her hand away. They stood there in the winter light of the schoolroom for a long time, not saying anything more, and the afternoon settled around them like something beginning, which is precisely what it was. The following days were a careful, deliberate reconstruction of something that had been built once and then set aside, and now needed to be built again with better materials and better understanding. Cole came to the school on Saturday, and they walked, which they had not done since October, along the creek that was frozen solid now, the willows along its banks bent under the weight of snow. The cold was ferocious, but they wore heavy coats, and he had brought her a pair of wool-lined gloves that he presented without ceremony, saying her hands had been cold in the schoolhouse, and he had noticed. She put them on and said they fit perfectly, and looked at him sidelong and said, "How did you know my size?" He said, "I asked Mrs. Foley." She shook her head slowly and said, "You are a very deliberate man, Cole Whitaker." He said, "When it matters." She said, "Does it matter?" He looked at her directly, in the open winter air with the frozen creek beside them and the bare aspens making their delicate pattern against the gray sky, and he said, "More than I can tell you properly yet. But I am going to keep trying." She looked away, and he saw the color in her face that was not entirely from the cold, and he thought that this exact moment, with the snow and the cold and everything still imperfect and unresolved, was somehow the most content he had felt in a very long time. They talked as they walked, really talked, the way they had talked in the autumn before everything became complicated. She told him things she had not told him before, about her mother's illness and the long years of grief, and the specific quality of loneliness that comes from being necessary to someone, and then suddenly not being needed by anyone. He listened without trying to fix it or soften it, which was what she needed, and she felt the particular relief of being heard by someone who is not looking for the exit. He told her things, too, about the years in Texas and the particular loneliness of the trail life, which was its own kind of thing, surrounded by people and still fundamentally alone. About why he had stayed in Wyoming, which was partly the land and partly the particular feeling of Redemption Creek, which despite its smallness had a quality of genuineness about it that he had not found in many places. About his father, who had been a hard-working and largely silent man who had shown love by doing rather than saying, which Cole recognized now as a pattern he had inherited without fully understanding it. Clara said, "Is that why you fixed my steps and brought me peaches?" He smiled. It was a real smile, not the polite half-smile he sometimes wore, but the full one that reached his eyes and changed his whole face, and that Clara had privately decided was one of her favorite things in the world. He said, "I suppose it is," she said. "I prefer the saying too, along with the doing." He said, "I am learning," she said. "You are doing well." The weeks of January passed, and the cold held, and Clara moved through her days with a lightness she had not felt since early October, a lightness that she was self-aware enough to recognize as related to the fact that things were resolving themselves in a direction she had not let herself hope for through the dark months of December. She was still teaching, still guiding her 17 students through reading and arithmetic and the particular wonder of learning, and she was good at it in the way that some people are simply good at their purpose, and knowing that she was where she was supposed to be was part of what made her happy. The other part was more complicated and considerably warmer. Cole came to town 3 times a week now, which was more than strictly necessary for a ranch foreman during the slow late winter period, and he was not making any particular effort to explain why he needed to be in town that often. And no one required an explanation, because small towns understand certain things without being told. Harold Finch practically vibrated with contained delight every time he saw Cole come through the door of the general store and then leave in the direction of the schoolhouse. Mrs. Foley said nothing at all, but her mouth curved at the corner whenever the subject arose. Pastor Greer said to Cole one Sunday afternoon after service, with the gentle frankness of a man of faith in a small town, "She is a good woman, Cole." Cole said he knew. The pastor said, "Good women deserve clear intentions." Cole looked at him for a moment and said, "Yes, sir, they do," and the pastor nodded and let the matter rest there. It was the second Saturday of February when Cole came to the school with a proposition. He came at the end of the school day, when the children had gone and Clara was cleaning the chalkboard, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, in the way that she associated now with moments of particular importance. And she turned and saw his expression, which was the expression of a man who has carefully prepared something and is nonetheless not entirely certain how it will go. He said, "I would like to take you to dinner at the Driftwood." She said, "You have taken me to dinner at the Driftwood before." He said, "I would like to take you this time with the clear understanding, stated plainly, that I am courting you, if that is something you are willing to consider." She set down her chalk. She turned fully toward him. She took a moment not to decide, because she had decided considerably before this moment, but to let herself fully feel the fact of being asked plainly and clearly and without ambiguity by someone who had earned the right to ask. She said, "I am willing to consider it." He said, "Then I would like to come calling properly with your permission and to do things in the right order." She said, "What order is that?" He said, "Dinner." "Then more dinners. Then I would like to bring you flowers in the spring when there are flowers to be had, because I am aware that winter is a limiting factor. And then at some point I would like to have a longer conversation about where things might go." She said, "That is a very organized plan." He said, "I am an organized person when I care about the outcome." She said, "And you care about the outcome?" He said, "Considerably." She said yes, and they went to dinner, and it was the same dining room at the Driftwood in that Clara had eaten in nearly every evening since September, and yet it was entirely different because of the way he looked at her across the small table, and the fact that nothing was uncertain or unspoken between them anymore. They talked for 3 hours. The other guests came and went, and the kitchen closed, and Mrs. Foley brought them coffee and dried apple cake and did not suggest they move along, because Mrs. Foley was a romantic who had been waiting for this development for months. February was a better month than January, and January had been considerably better than December. The snow was still heavy and the cold still serious, but February had that quality it sometimes had in Wyoming, where the days began to lengthen and the light changed almost imperceptibly, becoming a shade warmer and longer in the late afternoon, a small promise of what was coming. Clara noticed it. She had learned to read the Wyoming seasons in the months she had been here, their particular language and tempo. Cole taught her to ride. She had ridden before, with the gentle competence of someone who grew up in a city where riding was a leisure activity and not a necessity, but not in the Western way, not in the way that was about understanding the horse as a partner rather than a vehicle. He had a steady bay mare at the ranch that he said was patient enough to teach anyone, and on Sundays when the weather permitted they rode together in the valley south of the ranch, where the land was open and the mountains were visible in 3 directions. And the scale of it, the sheer tremendous scale of the Wyoming winter landscape, never quite ceased to astonish Clara. She said to him one Sunday afternoon, sitting their horses side by side on a small rise while the sun moved toward the western peaks, "I understand why you stayed here." He said, "Do you?" She said, "It is large enough to hold everything. Whatever you are carrying, it is small against this." He looked at the mountains and then at her, and the expression on his face was the one that still, after weeks of it, made something move quietly and completely in her chest. He said, That is exactly it. That is exactly why. March announced itself with a storm that blew in overnight and buried Redemption Creek under 2 feet of new snow, which seemed like winter making one final statement before conceding the argument. Clara woke to a world transformed and white and entirely impassable, and spent the day at the inn reading and writing letters, and waiting for the roads to clear. The school was closed for 3 days. On the third day, when the main street had been sufficiently cleared for travel, Cole appeared at the door of the Driftwood Inn with a red scarf wrapped around his neck and a look of determined cheerfulness that she associated with a man who has been cooped up for 3 days and has used the time to think. He said, "Come outside," she said. "It is still freezing." He said, "Yes, but the snow has a particular quality right now that is worth seeing. Bring your coat." She brought her coat and her new wool-lined gloves, and they went out into the white world, and he was right. There was a quality to it. The light was hitting the new snow at an angle that turned everything crystalline and faintly blue in the shadows and pure bright gold where the sun hit it. And the mountains to the west were so sharp and clear in the cold air that they looked like a painting. She stood in the street and turned slowly and looked at all of it. She said, "All right, I see." He said, "Worth it." She said, "Worth it." He was standing very close to her, because the path had been cleared only narrowly and there was a wall of snow on either side of them. And when she turned back to face him, she found him closer than she had realized, and his face was right there. Those steady brown eyes and the slight warmth at the corners of them that she had catalogued over many weeks and many careful observations. He said, "Clara." She said, "Yes." He said, "I want to tell you something that I have been finding various ways not to say for 4 months because I was concerned about saying it too soon, and then the business with Hatch intervened, and then I thought I needed to give you time to be less angry at me, and I think I have used up all of the available excuses." She said, "I think you might have." He said, "I am in love with you." The words fell into the winter air between them, with the clarity and finality of something that had been true for a long time, and was only now being said aloud. She stood in the crystalline snow light and looked at him and felt everything reorganize itself around that fact the way iron filings organize themselves around a magnet, quickly and completely, and in the only configuration that makes sense. She said, "I have been in love with you since November, since the peaches." He said, "Since the peaches." She said, "It seemed so specific and so exactly right that I did not know what to do with it." He said, "What would you like to do with it now?" She reached up and took hold of the lapel of his coat with one gloved hand, and she kissed him, in the middle of Main Street in Redemption Creek in the last days of winter, with the snow piled up on either side of them, and the mountains bright against the morning sky. And he kissed her back with the specific and complete attention of a man who has been very patient for a very long time and intends to make proper use of the moment. Harold Finch, who happened to be looking out the window of the general store at that precise moment, told everyone in town about it within 40 minutes. By noon it was general knowledge, and by evening it was being discussed at the Copper Spur with considerable warmth and approval. Spring came to Redemption Creek the way Wyoming spring always did, reluctantly at first and then all at once, the snow retreating from the valley while it still clung to the mountains, the creek breaking up with a sound like small thunder, the first green appearing in the south-facing slopes with the tentative hope of something returning. Clara had not known how much she was waiting for spring until it arrived, and when the first wildflowers appeared in the meadows east of town, she went out on a Tuesday afternoon after school and stood in them and felt like herself in a way that winter, for all its beauty, had made it difficult to feel. Cole found the wildflowers first. He was the one who told her where to look, which direction to ride, and which meadow was the first to bloom in this valley because the creek ran through it, and the aspect was south, and the soil was rich. He knew the land in that intimate way that comes from years of moving through it on horseback in every season and every weather, and he shared what he knew with an openness that Clara found deeply appealing in a man, this willingness to teach, to say, "Here is what I know and I want to give it to you." He brought her flowers as he had promised, and he came calling in the proper and organized way he had outlined. And they spent the spring learning each other in the fuller and more detailed way that follows the winter of crisis and reconciliation, learning each other's habits and preferences and small daily patterns. She learned that he was up before dawn every day without effort and was useless at anything after 10 in the evening. He learned that she kept a journal that she did not share with anyone, and that she had an absolute requirement for strong coffee in the morning that she called a preference but was in fact a need. She learned that he was generous with his time and his knowledge and slower with words, that he showed feeling through action so naturally that it had to be pointed out to him when the words were also needed. He was working on this. She was patient with the work. She had words with him, real words, once in April, about an incident in which she had been attempting to repair a loose board on her classroom wall, and he had appeared out of nowhere and taken the hammer out of her hand without asking. And she had told him very clearly that, while she appreciated his helpfulness, she was capable of driving a nail, and furthermore that he should ask before assuming. She required assistance with something she had not asked for assistance with. He stood in the schoolroom with the hammer in his hand and the expression of a man who is recalibrating, and then he said she was completely right and handed back the hammer and watched her drive the nail very efficiently, and then said, "I see that you did not need the hammer taken." She said, "No." He said, "I am sorry." She said, "Thank you." He said, "Would you like help with the second board?" She said, "Yes, please." They worked on the wall together, and the afternoon was entirely pleasant, and Clara thought that this exactly, the being able to say the hard thing and have it heard without drama or collapse, was what she had not known she was looking for and had somehow found. The Harlan spread held its spring roundup in May, and Cole was working 20-hour days for a solid week and a half, and Clara did not see him except briefly twice during the whole period. She did not mind exactly, because she understood the rhythm of the ranching life, and because she was busy herself with the end of the school year approaching, and the planning of final examinations and the small ceremony they did each June when the oldest students completed the year. But she noticed his absence in the way that she had learned, through the long winter, was a specific and identifiable sensation that she preferred to its opposite. He came to the school on the Sunday after the roundup was finished, looking tired in the deep-down way of hard physical work, and she made him sit down and brought him coffee that she kept in a small pot on the wood stove she used to heat the classroom in the cold months and still used out of habit. And she sat across from him, and they talked quietly while he drank the coffee, and the tension of the hard week gradually left his shoulders. She said, "You look like you could sleep for 2 days." He said, "I could." "I do not plan to," she said. "What are your plans?" He said, "I was thinking about talking to you about something. I have been thinking about it for some time, and I wanted to wait until I had a clear head, but the roundup took longer than expected and a clear head has been in short supply." She said, "It looks like a moderately clear head to me." He said, "It is clearer than last week." She said, "Then talk." He set down the coffee cup. He looked at her across the small distance of the schoolroom, with the spring light coming through the windows and the smell of chalk and wood smoke and Wyoming air all mixed together, and he said, "I want to marry you, Clara. I have been certain of it since February, and I have been trying to find the right moment, and I think possibly the right moment does not find itself and you have to make it." She looked at him. The words sat in the room with a clean, simple, entirely uncomplicated weight, and she thought about all the distance they had traveled to arrive here, the autumn walks and the winter silence and the cold and the anger and the reconciliation and the spring and all the small daily accumulations of knowing and being known, and she thought that she had never in her life been more certain of anything. She said, "I want to marry you too." He said, "Is that a yes?" She said, "That is very much a yes." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, small and gold with a single small turquoise stone set in it, which was not a diamond and was not what might have been expected, but which was entirely right, because he had looked at it in the jeweler's window in Cheyenne and thought immediately of the color of her eyes in October, and that had been that. She looked at it on her finger and felt that there was poetry in the fact that he had thought of her eyes. She told him so. He said, "I have been accused of being a practical man, but occasionally there are exceptions." She said, "I am very glad to be one of them." They were married in June, on a Saturday, in the church with the bell that rang every Sunday and sometimes on Tuesdays. Pastor Greer performed the ceremony with evident pleasure, and the church was full, which surprised Clara somewhat, though it perhaps should not have, because she had spent 9 months building a life in this town, and the town had been paying attention. All 17 of her students were there with their families, and Harold Finch cried openly and with absolutely no shame, and Mrs. Foley wore her best dress and sat in the second row with the satisfied expression of someone whose investment has paid out well. Cole stood at the front of the church in a dark coat that he had made in Cheyenne, and he watched her come down the aisle on the arm of Sheriff Greer, who had offered after she mentioned that she had no family in the area, and the expression on his face when he saw her was the expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, the one where all of the careful control of him, the steady deliberateness that was so much a part of who he was, simply stepped aside entirely, and what was underneath it was nothing complicated, just a man looking at the thing he loved most in the world and feeling the full weight of the fact that he got to keep it. She cried. She had not planned to, but she did, just briefly, at the moment he took her hand, and the look he gave her then was very different, warm and steady, and a little amused, which she thought was probably the best possible thing for him to look like at that particular moment. They spoke their vows in the clear Wyoming June light, with the whole town watching, and when it was done and they walked out of the church into the summer morning, Clara felt something complete and finished in the best possible way, the way of something that has been built right all the way through and will stand. The celebration after was in the open field beside the church, because Harold Finch had organized it, and Harold Finch believed in doing things with appropriate scale. There were tables covered with every kind of food that the women of Redemption Creek had spent 2 days preparing, and there was music from 2 fiddle players who set up near the church steps and played through the afternoon while people danced in the cut grass, and there was laughter of the specific and generous kind that happens in small communities when something good occurs. Cole danced with her, which she had not known he could do, and he could do it well, the easy, confident way of someone who had danced at bunkhouse celebrations across Texas and Wyoming for a decade. She said, "You are full of surprises." He said, "Fewer than before. I intend to be entirely legible from here." She said, "I like some surprises." He said, "I will keep that in mind." They danced until the sun went behind the mountains, and the fiddles shifted to slower music, and the evening came in cool and purple, and scented with sage, and Clara thought she had no language adequate to what she was feeling, and that this was absolutely fine, that the feeling did not require language, that it was sufficient simply to feel it fully in this particular body, in this particular place, on this particular evening. They settled into a life together. Cole had been living in the bunkhouse at the Harlan Ranch, and they had discussed the arrangement at length over the spring, and what they had decided was that Cole would build a house. He had saved money over the years with the purposeful discipline of a man who always intended someday to have something to save it for, and he had spoken with Mr. Harlan, who had offered Cole 20 acres of the southern end of the ranch property at a fair price as a settlement for 10 years of reliable service, and Cole had accepted. He built the house himself over the summer, with help from a rotating company of men from the town who showed up on Saturdays with tools and strong backs, because that was how things were built in Redemption Creek. She came out to see it take shape, each week a little more of it realized, the frame and then the walls and then the roof, and she walked through the rooms before they had floors and imagined furniture in each of them, and felt the particular pleasure of making a place. She told him in late July that she was with child. He was at the building site when she told him, standing on what would be the porch with sawdust on his shirt and a level in his hand, and he looked at her when she said it with an expression that moved through several things very quickly: surprise, and then a particular vulnerability that she rarely saw in him, and then something that settled into the deepest and most uncomplicated joy she had ever seen on a person's face. He set down the level. He crossed the unfinished porch to her and put both hands on her face very carefully and looked at her for a moment and said, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" She said, "I am perfectly well." He said, "Good," and he kissed her forehead with a tenderness that she felt all the way through. She continued teaching through the fall, because the school year began in September and she loved it, and there was no reason not to. And the children of Redemption Creek were excellent at pretending not to notice that their teacher was visibly expecting a child by November, which consideration she appreciated. She was tired in a way that was specific and particular, the tiredness of a body doing large and important work, and Cole was attentive about it in his characteristic way, which meant he said almost nothing about it and did quite a lot, making sure she had good food and enough firewood, and that her feet were warm, which she found both endearing and occasionally stifling, and she told him so, and he acknowledged the point and tried to modulate, which was all she could ask. Their house was finished in October, and moving into it was one of the great pleasures of Clara's life. She arranged the furniture and hung curtains at the windows, which were large for a frontier house, because she had said specifically that she wanted large windows and Cole had built large windows, and the light came in from the south and the east, and the rooms had the clean, bright quality she had wanted. She made it a home in the way she understood home, with care and intention and the small particular objects that made a place feel inhabited and permanent. She kept teaching through November, and the school board was entirely accommodating, because the school board understood that replacing Miss Clara, who was now Mrs. Whitaker, would be considerably more difficult than making allowance for her circumstances. She loved her students, and they knew it, and the feeling was, in the way of children who understand more than adults give them credit for, clearly reciprocated. The baby came in the first week of January, almost exactly 1 year after the resolution of the business with Doyle Hatch, which Clara would later note with some amusement as a date worth marking. It was a boy, healthy and loud and possessed of a remarkable amount of dark hair, and Cole sat beside her with the baby in his arms and looked at his son with an expression that was entirely new, a kind of odd, tender incredulity, as though the existence of this specific small person were the most extraordinary thing he had ever encountered, which it was. Clara watched him hold the baby and thought that she had not known it was possible to love two people this completely at the same time. She thought that turned out to be wrong, that love of this kind did not divide but multiplied, that there was somehow more of it the more it was required. They named him James for Cole's father. The winter of 1884 was gentler than the winter before had been, or perhaps it was that everything was different now. Everything was different in the specific way that happens when a person is exactly where they are supposed to be and knows it. Clara walked from the house to the schoolhouse in the mornings with the cold air on her face and the smoke rising from the chimneys of Redemption Creek, and thought about how 9 months ago she had looked at this same sky and felt lonely down to her bones. The difference was not the sky. The sky was the same. James grew with the focused efficiency of a healthy baby in a house that is warm and well-provisioned and full of love. He had Cole's eyes and Clara's determination, which was apparent by 6 weeks when he had decided to spend less time sleeping than was recommended, and more time examining the world. Cole held him in the evenings after dinner while Clara read or wrote her letters, and she would look up from her book and see the two of them, the big, quiet man and the small, fierce baby, and the picture they made together was so precisely and completely good that it required a conscious effort not to stop and stare at it. She went back to teaching in March, when the worst of the winter had passed and she felt capable of it, and Mrs. Foley, who had retired from managing the inn and lived a comfortable life of community engagement, took James during the school days with a tenderness that bordered on reverence. The children at school were fascinated by the existence of the baby and treated the information of his specific activities with great interest and seriousness. Cole and Clara fell into the rhythm of the life they had made, which was a good rhythm, steady and warm and full. The ranch work was demanding in the old familiar way, and he was good at it in the way he had always been good at it. But there was something different now, some slight but real shift in the quality of his presence at home, a greater ease, an openness that had not been quite there before. She noticed it and did not comment on it directly, just received it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who understands that love does not only happen at the dramatic moments, but accumulates in the daily ones. They had disagreements. They had them honestly and with the directness that they had established from the beginning as the terms of their connection. She was better at saying difficult things quickly, and he needed more time to process before he could speak clearly, and they learned to work with the gap between those two styles. They had a particular disagreement in the summer of 1884 about whether to take on a second homestead that abutted their 20 acres, Cole thinking it was a sound investment, and Clara thinking the timing was premature given their current obligations. And the discussion was thorough, and at moments heated, and at the end of it, they reached a position that was neither of their original positions but was better than either, which Clara thought was one of the markers of a good partnership. They did not take the second homestead that year. They bought it the following spring, when the timing was right and the money was there, and the decision felt right in the way that decisions feel when they have been properly made. James took his first steps on a Sunday afternoon in September, across the kitchen floor of their house, with a focused and slightly outraged expression that was so characteristic that both his parents recognized it immediately and laughed in the same breath. He crossed the 3 feet between the table leg he had been holding in Cole's outstretched hands with the tottering, determined gait of someone who has decided this is happening, and nothing is going to intervene. And Cole caught him and held him up, and said something very quiet that Clara did not fully hear. Said it directly to his son with his face close to the baby's face. And the moment had the particular quality of the private ones, the ones that are not for showing but simply for having. She was expecting their second child by the following winter. She told Cole on an evening in November, and this time he was not surprised in the same way, but he was moved in a way that was differently particular, the joy of a man who knows already what is coming and wants it again. He said, "A brother or a sister for James." She said, "We will see which." He said, "Whatever it is, it will be more than we deserve." She said, "I do not think that." He said, "No," she said, "I think it is exactly what we deserve, all of it. I think we did hard things and made mistakes and found our way back, and that makes us people who deserve to have good things happen to them." He looked at her for a moment across the supper table of their own kitchen in their own house on their own land with their son asleep in the next room, and the expression on his face was the one she loved most, the one where the careful, deliberate control of him was entirely at rest, and what was there instead was the simple, complete thing underneath it. He said, "I think you might be right," she said. "I usually am. You are getting better at noticing." He said, "I am working on it." The second child, born in the late spring of 1885, was a girl. She came into the world at dawn, which Clara thought was entirely appropriate. At dawn on a morning in June, when the meadows outside their windows were full of the wildflowers that had come back for the 3rd time since Clara arrived in Wyoming. They named her Rose, for no particular reason except that it was the name that felt right when they looked at her. This small, pink, opinionated new person who arrived in their life with the confidence of someone who belongs precisely where she is. James regarded his sister with a mixture of suspicion and interest that Clara thought was entirely reasonable and quite accurate. Within a week he had assigned himself a role in relation to her that was equal parts guardian and tormentor, which was, as far as Clara understood it, the traditional role of elder brothers everywhere. Redemption Creek grew through those years, slowly and organically, the way frontier towns grew when they were in good locations and had the kind of community that drew people rather than driving them away. New families came. New businesses opened. A second store and a small doctor's office, and eventually a telegraph office that connected the town to Cheyenne and Denver and the wider world beyond. Clara welcomed the growth because growth brought children and children were her purpose. And by 1886, she had 29 students in her school and had begun discussing with the school board the possibility of building a larger schoolhouse. She had become the kind of person in Redemption Creek that she had not known she was becoming while it was happening. One of those people around whom a community organizes itself. Someone whose presence is assumed and valued, and whose absence would leave a specific and identifiable gap. She was aware of it with a quiet, deep gratitude, because she had arrived here with 2 trunks and a satchel and the hope of starting over, and she had gotten something considerably larger than a start. One autumn evening in 1886, when James was not yet 3 and Rose was a year old, and the aspens along the creek had turned gold again in the way they did every October that Clara found newly astonishing every time, she and Cole sat on the porch of their house in the last of the evening light and listened to the quiet. It was not an empty quiet. It was the full and inhabited quiet of a life that has a great deal in it and is currently, for this one specific moment, still. The children were asleep. The ranch was settled for the evening. The mountains to the west were turning the particular purple-pink of a Wyoming sunset that Clara could not have described before she saw it for the first time and now could not imagine not knowing. Cole said without preamble, in the way he had of saying important things simply, "I think about that winter sometimes." She said, "Do you?" He said, "I think about what it cost you, the anger and the hurt and the loneliness of it. I think about it and I wish I had found a better way." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. Then she said, "I think about it too." He said, "What do you think when you think about it?" She said, "I think it was the wrong choice and the right choice at the same time. I think you did what you believed was right for the right reasons and that it cost both of us something. And I think we built what we have now on the other side of that cost, which means it is part of what we have." He said, "Can something that caused pain be part of something good?" She said, "I think so. I think most good things have some pain in the material they are made of. The question is whether you built something worth it." He said, "Do you think we did?" She looked at their house, at the window where the lamp was burning in the room where James was sleeping, at the garden she had planted in the spring that had given them enough vegetables to put up for 3 months of winter. She looked at the mountains and the aspens and the creek she could hear but not see in the darkness, and she looked at him, at the profile of the man beside her in the evening light, steady and present in hers. She said, "Yes, I think we absolutely did." He took her hand in the way he had taken it 3 years before in a frozen street, while the winter lay around them like a held breath, with the same certainty and the same care. And they sat together on the porch of their house on their land in the valley they had claimed as theirs while the Wyoming night came in, and the stars appeared over the mountains. More stars than Clara had ever seen in Cincinnati. More stars than she could count or name. A whole brilliant, ridiculous abundance of them. And she thought that this was what it meant to have started over. Not the leaving of one place but the arriving at another. Not the end of one story but the beginning of everything that mattered and. She leaned her head against his shoulder and felt the solid warmth of him beside her and was, in the complete and specific way that very few people manage, and she had almost not allowed herself, entirely and thoroughly and irrevocably happy. The next morning James woke at the unreasonable hour he had established as his standard, and announced his needs with the volume and directness of someone who has never once doubted that his needs will be met. Cole got up, because he was already awake, and Clara heard his low voice in the next room and her son's gradually settling sounds, and she lay in their bed in the early morning gray and looked at the ceiling and smiled. The school bell rang from across the valley, because it was a Tuesday and Pastor Greer was moved by the Spirit, and the sound carried clear and clean through the October air, and somewhere in the willows along the creek a bird was doing its morning business with great enthusiasm, and the whole world was simply itself, ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure, and Clara Beaumont Whitaker, who had arrived in Redemption Creek with a satchel full of her mother's recipes and the hope of something new, thought that her mother would have loved this place, that she would have loved the mountains and the sky and the particular honest quality of life here, and she thought that bringing that love here, carrying it west from Cincinnati and planting it in Wyoming ground, was the best thing she had ever done. She got up. She put on her coat and her wool-lined gloves, and she went into the kitchen where Cole was making coffee and James was sitting on the floor investigating a wooden spoon, with the focused intensity that characterized all of his investigations, and Rose was beginning to make waking sounds from the cradle by the window, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and the good solid smell of a house that is lived in and loved in. Cole looked up when she came in and handed her a cup of coffee without being asked, because after 3 years he knew the order of operations, and she took it and held it in both hands and looked at him over the rim of it, and he looked back at her with those steady brown eyes that she had catalogued so carefully through an autumn and a winter and a spring, and kept cataloging every day since, and in them was everything, the whole history of the two of them. The walks along the creek and the books and the peaches and the cold, terrible winter, and the spring return, and the ring with the turquoise stone, and the house and the children, and every ordinary morning, and every difficult evening, and every moment of grace between them, all of it held there in his eyes in the morning light. She said, "Good morning." He said, "Good morning." Outside, the aspens were gold and the mountains were clear and the creek was running, and the day was beginning in the way that good days do, quietly and entirely, with everything it needed already present.